Good afternoon, committee. I'd like to call the meeting to order. And I'll look to my colleagues to see if there's any disclosures of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, we'll move on to consents. Would anybody like anything pulled from the consent menu? All right, seeing none, I would take a motion to put forward the balance. Councillor Helmer.
Just two brief comments. One on 7. I think it's helpful to have the variance report give us a sense of what's going on in terms of the timeline for some of those items. I think it's clear why certain things are delayed, and frankly, they've been delayed for a while. I think that's helpful. I was thinking around the tree protection bylaw. The implications are listed as the city's not recouping the true value, which is certainly true. But I wonder if we could be quantifying it. I don't want to create more work, frankly, in the area that's, needs some attention to get back on schedule. But, there are trees being removed from the boulevards that not only would we be recouping more money, but some of them probably wouldn't get removed. And so I think we might want to think about how much it's costing us to take this amount of time before we get around to the boulevards, both in the cost of the trees themselves and their ecosystem functions, and then the money side of, if they were removed, how much money we would be receiving. So I don't, that's just really a comment. I think it's good to have it articulated what the implications are, but I was thinking about dollar signs when I was looking at that as well. And on the building division monthly report, glad to see another really busy year for building in the city, $1.1 billion. I guess we're kind of getting used to it in the sense that the year before was 1.4. But really, if you look back previous years, this is very unusual to have this kind of building activity. It's very, very busy. And our building division staff are doing a great job trying to keep up with all of that work. I know the private sector is really driving a lot of construction. Our ability to keep up with it and actually approve those things in a timely way is really important, in terms of how the economy is performing, how fast housing gets built. And I think they're doing a good job.
Thank you, Councillor Helmer. From Councillor Cassidy, I saw indication she would like 6 pulled, or just to speak to it. Okay, we'll pull 6 then. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up with Councillors Helmer's comments on item number 7. I noticed that there were a number of initiatives coming forward at the end of this month, especially as it relates to the websites, the application signs, the community engagement part, the mail out, as well as notices to tenants. And I just would like to know, through you, Mr. Chair, to staff, are we still within the timelines? I know we're almost at the end of this month, but are we anticipating that this information will be given to the community and things will be updated?
Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Chair, that project is virtually on ready to be implemented. Essentially, what we're waiting for is now an application to come in that meets those requirements, including the new illustrations that are required to be posted on the new signage. So we're ready to go. It's just a matter of now just fine tuning and actually waiting for that first application to come in.
Thank you for that. And I would assume that applies to the website as well and the other notices that we will be making changes to.
Mr. Chair, the answer is yes. It was a fairly comprehensive project that would include the website, the notices, and the signage, all packaged as one new notification process that we would advise and allow Londoners to participate in.
Okay, thank you. We've got a motion on the floor moved by Councillor Park, looking for a seconder to move items 2 through 5, 7, and 8. Seconded by Councillor Helmer. Any further discussion? Seeing none, open the vote. Councillor Cassidy indicates a yay manually.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, we're going to move over to number 6 in a second. I'd just like to welcome Professor Billings, Fanshawe College class here. Hi, everybody. Glad you could join us. And as I say too often, there's two things in life you never want to see being made. One is sausages, the other is policy. We do the policy side here. So, Councillor Cassidy is just working on some technical issues, but I believe she wanted to speak to item number 6. Councillor Cassidy.
My apologies, Mr. Chair, of having some technical issues with my computer, but it might be fixed now. My question through you to staff is, we referred this back. We had this BDC zone, and staff originally were looking for special provision on the BDC zone. Even though a BDC zone in other parts of the city allows for commercial in the front of this kind of building, and then some residential in the rear portion of the building. But the special provision was saying no to any residential on the main floor of these buildings. So now we referred this back to staff at the last council meeting. Staff have come back, and we see the BDC zone with this special provision removed for one block, but not another. So I just want to hear from staff to see what's the difference between these two blocks. Why one would have this prohibition on residential and the other one does not.
Mr. Yeoman. Or Mr. Pampilli.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there are 4 BDC blocks within this subdivision. I believe when it first came in for approval, there was a prohibition of residential on 2 of the 4 blocks. And then, so going forward, so blocks, I believe 47 and 46 had a prohibition on there. So we're keeping that, we're retaining that prohibition on those 2 blocks. When we came back here earlier in February or at the end of January, I can't recall now, we came back with a prohibition on all 4 blocks, but we've come back and we've reconsidered it on the 1 block, the larger block at the corner. And the main reason we did that is we looked at the, we've prohibited it on just a single-story development. But if the developer comes in with a mixed-use development, which is the zone and the form of development that we're envisioning for this area, we would allow for residential on the ground floor to the rear of commercial uses. And the reason why we've opened up that that provision on that block in particular is just the depth of that block would make it more viable for that form of development, for some form of viable residential in the rear. And also that block, the interface that block has with the north side of the street, which is residential as well. It makes a lot of sense to allow for that. Now, the block on the opposite side isn't as deep, and its interfaces with a small parquet on the north side, so it doesn't lend itself to that same form of development. The other 2 blocks never had, always had a prohibition on ground floor residential, and we're maintaining that.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So it's 46 and 47 that we're talking about then? So the one that interfaces the park, this is, and my understanding as well, going back to my discussions with staff and with the proponent, my understanding was that there was some confusion as to what kind of residential development was being proposed, and there was concern that it wasn't all contained within one building, more or less. And so I think that hurdle has been overcome, and so we're talking about a mixed-use building, one site. So I don't understand why, if we were talking about the same kind of building on the other block, why we wouldn't allow that same sort of flexibility, especially in my view, if it's interfacing with a park. It makes sense to me to have residential units connecting with a park as opposed to commercial units.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So a BDC zone is really intended to be commercial in character. Residential is secondary in nature to the BDC zone. Staff feel that we've accommodated the requests from the applicant. We've provided some more flexibility. We've created increased heights and more residential opportunities above as well. We really would like to see, though, that the buildings that come in are in floor plates that are conducive to a commercial design and commercial product that's introduced for the area.
So again, I'll go back to what I said in the previous planning meeting when we talked about this. I understand where staff's coming from as far as wanting a minimum floor plate for commercial, and so that the BDC zone is not, the integrity of the BDC zone is maintained. So that there should be a certain percentage, if you will, of commercial. So I would be willing to have a special provision in there indicating a minimum percentage of the floor plate being commercial, but still allowing the residential to take place in the rear of the building. Again, knowing that this is a residential area overall, it's a mixed-use development, but there's a lot of residential on there, and with the existence of the park in the area, it makes sense to me to have residential there. So that's what I would like to see if you want to ensure the integrity of this mixed-use development and ensure the integrity of the commercial part of the BDC zone. I can't forget either that other BDC zones in the city don't have this kind of prohibition, and we seem to be treating this particular subdivision in a different way than we have other BDC zones. So I would move if oh man, my system's messed up again. But if I would like to put a motion on the floor, Mr. Chair, to and forgive me that I think it's block 46 that we have allowed the residential to take place in the rear. So my motion would be to move forward and accept the staff recommendation for block 46, but for block 47, to allow a certain percentage of residential at the rear of the main floor commercial, as long as that commercial is facing the Main Street part of the subdivision.
So Councillor Cassidy, I think in order to make such a motion, we'd probably have to be able to have a good sense of what that percentage was. But before we move forward with that, I'd like to see from the committee if there was anyone who wanted to entertain a second to that motion. Seeing none at this time. Councillor Cassidy.
Then alternatively, Mr. Chair, I'd like to move with the staff recommendation on block 46 and refer block 47 back to staff and see if I have a seconder on referral.
I'll look to the committee for that. Seeing none. Councillor Hopkins and then Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a follow-up question. I know this recommendation came to us a month or so ago with the two barns going to an appeal that was to be held the following day, and I'm just wondering through you to staff if we could have an update on that appeal or if we know anything about it.
Through you, Mr. Chair. From what I understand, it was a pre-hearing conference, so they were just setting parameters for the hearing itself, discussing who was going to be witnesses, that kind of thing. So as far as I know, I don't even think another hearing date has been set, but they were just meeting on with respect to that. So,
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. So for these other blocks, I think it's 45, 48, and 47, where we have business district commercial. I know it was pointed out that the depth of the lots is not the same as it is for 46. I wonder if we could just put some numbers to that so we can understand, you know, what the variation is. I'm looking at the plan and it looks like it's 40% deeper, depending which way is the back. And so I wonder if our staff could just give us a sense of the depth of the lots when we're talking about there being differences. Because 3 of them look to be the same and the 4th one is quite a bit larger.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. I can confirm that the depth of, so block 46 is the zoning that you see in front of you with the special provision that now permits residential to the rear along Kleinberg Drive. Blocks 45 and 48, to clarify, through the original rezoning that we did back in 2014 for the draft plan, we removed the ability to put residential on the first floor. We had always intended that there would be mixed use buildings on both of these sites because they are quite small. So one of the things we had ensured was through the zoning, there would only be residential above and commercial and office at grade. And then block 47 is the other block to the south of Kleinberg Drive on the east side of Blackwater Road. And that has a depth of approximately 60 meters. So it is less than half, I believe, of the depth of the other business district commercial to the west of Blackwater Road.
Thank you, Ms. Posado. Councilor
Okay,
Elmer.
thank you for that. And I'm glad that we referred this back. I think it makes sense for block 46 to have some allowance for ground floor residential along the way, the concept that the applicant has described. I think there's room for it, and I think it works with the adjacent land uses. For the other 3 blocks, I know that they're all zone business district commercial, but they're different blocks. And I don't think it works there, and that's why I'm not supporting what Councillor Cassidy is suggesting. It's not as though I don't think the referral was a good idea in the first place, but I don't think for these other 3 blocks that it makes sense to allow ground floor residential.
Thank you. I think, Councillor Park, no. Councillor Cassidy, did you have your hand up or your pencil? Just a pencil. Okay. As staff recommendation, I would seek a motion for that or something else in the alternative. Have it moved by Councillor Park and seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any further discussion? Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to support the staff recommendation at this time, but I have every intention of pulling this at council so that we can have further discussion.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a mover, Councillor Park, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. I'll call the vote if no further discussion. Seeing none, the vote is open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, thank you. And we'll move on to scheduled items. Item number 9, which is the item not to be heard before 4 p.m., is Mr. Levin, the Chair of the Environmental and Ecological Planning Advisory Committee. Welcome, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to call your attention to Clause 12 on the EPAC report, and there's actually an amendment. I had shared this information with both, with Mr. Yeoman. Mr. Yeoman and Mr. Fleming and I had a meeting about this particular area, and members of EPAC who were involved in the review of an EIS pointed out their concern with all the various projects that are going on, the various EISs and the various EAs that are going on, both by proponents and the municipality. So I can show you the area that's in question. I've got here we are. So we are at, come on, where's the mouse? There we are. So where the red dot is Colonel Talbot and Pack, okay? The area circled was the most recent, closest to the intersection was the most recent EIS. It was an EIS that only covered one phase of a development that'll have 2 phases. And the concern is they're connected. So the concern is you're doing a bit of piecemeal investigation of the natural heritage system. That piece of the second phase is to the further to the east. So you see the water course. The water course was studied as part of the EA that the city did for the stormwater management facility that's on the west side of Colonel Talbot down Pack Road. And in investigating this whole situation, there was also an EA that the city did in 2016 for the Colonel Talbot pumping station decommissioning. So there were a number of studies, and then on top of that, the proponent of the land where the large woodland is did an EIS separate from the proponent to the northwest, and because the little woodland is on somebody else's property. It's never been studied. The concern being there's a connection, there's an overland water connection to the larger woodland where there's a wetland. Further south, there's another development that was done, the EIS was completed, and the concern that we had as EPAC was, you've got all these different pieces going on. How are you doing good planning? How are you doing ecosystem planning that's spoken to in the OP policies? So what came out of EPAC was reviewed by Mr. Yeoman, so the amendment that you see has been reviewed, and he's interested in how this might be operationalized to get a better one-time look at the whole area picture as opposed to this independently getting bits and pieces. And as many of you already know, EISs only cover the area that's being studied, not the impacts outside the site. So I ask that you approve what EPAC has before you as amended.
Okay, thank you. So I'm curious with respect to that, if I might go to staff for a bit of a response. I do know my time on EPAC, I certainly encountered very similar situations where the EIS ended at the end of the proposal, and there were linkages associated with other environmental features. So perhaps Mr. Yeoman?
Through the chair, yeah, so we have some exploratory work to do here. This is obviously an area of the city that has a lot of active development interest, both in terms of formal applications and thoughts for future development as well. Mr. Levin's also pointing out capital projects that are city initiated that are outside the development process as well. So you have development processes that are going on with construction processes as well. So we do need to take a look at how we can do better to try to knit some of this together going forward and to address some of the concerns that have been raised by EPAC, and we will be doing that.
Thank you. And Mr. Yeoman, the recommendations that have been put forward with the amendments, are those actionable by your team or the teams that would be involved with this? So.
To the chair, my belief is that yes, they can be. It is advice and requests that are coming forward, and we will take and operationalize that advice and request.
Thank you, and I kind of jumped on top of my committee. My apologies. I'd look to the committee for any questions. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Your questions are always appreciated. I, too, want to thank Mr. Levin for explaining this area, because I found even in the report, it's very disjointed in trying to understand. We're talking in particular to Pack Road and Colonel Talbot, but in the report, we're referring to this whole area. So I know sitting here on the committee, I'm glad that staff are going to be exploring it further and how this whole area is coming together with the different applications involved. How will it be explored? So I'm just trying to understand, given all the applications, the potential in this area to be developed, where will you be starting with taking these EISs or exploring this area? Just.
Through the chair, Mr. Fleming just added something very valuable. The Southwest Area Plan did do some preliminary environmental work here that's obviously helped set things up at a high-level planning perspective for the area going forward. We're going to be looking at the various applications, some of the EIS requirements and things like that. I don't have a formal action plan to deliver to you right now. I wish I did, but we will be exploring that in the coming months for sure.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Further comments or questions from the committee? Seeing none, just to you, Mr. Levin, you're proposing some amendments to the report that came from the committee. Is the committee in accord with the amendments that you're proposing?
Yes, they are, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. So I have the motion up on the board here. Councillor Helmer's moved it. I'd look for a seconder at this time. Seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, Mr. Levin, for coming, and thanks to your committee for the recommendations. And now we move on to item 10, which is a public participation meeting for an application by Dan Core Construction, the property located at 2150 Oxford Street East. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do just want to acknowledge the work that Mike Corby did on this file. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here tonight, but I want to give him due credit. So this is an application on Oxford Street, right at the eastern part of the city near the airport. You'll see here it's sandwiched in between Crumlin Road and the Veterans Memorial Parkway, and just east of Crumlin Road there, of course, is our airport. It's a fairly large industrial site, and in fact, there's 4 phases. What you're looking at here is phase 1, 2, and 3, and the 4th phase is supposed to occur to the north of that oil easement. Phase 1 and 3 are currently under construction, and so this application only applies to phase 2. And here's just another bit of a context. This context does become important as part of the rationale for support for this application. I just wanted to point out the proximity again to the airport, to the Veterans Memorial Parkway, as well as the industrial area here. So the request for this rezoning and an official plan amendment is to permit a 2,200 square meter office style building. The reason we say office style is it could be converted for industrial uses as well, so it could be a mix of the two. The request is for an official plan amendment to add offices as a permitted use, as well as the square footage of that additional 200 square meters. In fact, 2,000 square meter offices are already permitted, but I'll get into that in a second. So the subject site is designated light industrial. The light industrial zoning and policies permit offices, just I'll call them general offices, as long as they are in association with an industrial use. Also, the policies do permit a standalone office as long as it's a support office, which is a very specific category of offices. And so the request here is to broaden that amount of, or the usability of the offices to a more general office use. So the current zoning would permit 2,000 square meters of support office on the site. And again, the request is to expand the GFA by 200 square meters and also to permit a wider range of offices. The London plan policies effectively mirror the existing official plans, so they're virtually the same. And that's why a special policy is required to permit the use. So the subject site, in our opinion, is located in a fairly unique context in that it's located at 2 gateways into the city. One is through that Veterans Memorial Parkway if you're coming up from the 401 corridor, but also from the airport. And on top of that, it also has that proximity to the industrial area. This intersection right now does provide an opportunity to capture some of that niche market, that market that wants to be near the airport and also the Veterans Memorial Parkway, and or also requires proximity to the offices around there. Also of note is the context that right across the street is it looks like an office, but it is in association with a industrial use. And so it's got that office corridor as well to the, I'll just go back a second here, to the southwest corner of that intersection is approved zoning as well for general offices. So you could see this one small segment of Oxford Street provides that niche opportunity to capture some of the office uses in association with industrial and the gateway. So staff are recommending support of the request for expanded office uses and for that increase in the GFA. We believe it's consistent with the provincial policy statement. The requested official plan amendment would now then have the policy permission to allow this to go ahead, and then the zoning would implement it. We believe that given its location near the airport and the Veterans Memorial Parkway, as well as the industrial area, that this site represents a unique opportunity to capture this office use.
Thank you, Mr. Tomczyk. I would look to, we still have the public participation meeting to open, so we have that on the board right now. It's been moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Park. And the vote is open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. And I'd look to our committee for any questions of a technical nature before moving on to the applicant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to staff, this particular site, if I remember correctly, was sold to the proponent as part of the industrial land development strategy. Is that correct?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct, it was. Forgive me.
More on that later. Thank you.
Any further questions from the committee? I'd look to the applicant, is the representative for the applicant here? Would like to come forward. I've asked both staff and applicants and any of the presenters from the public to limit their comments to 5 minutes, just in the interest of keeping the meeting moving. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm Gary Blazik, planning consultant. I'm working in support of Kirkness Consulting that made the application on behalf of Dancor. We are in complete agreement with the staff recommendation. We believe it'll result in a very attractive office building, similar in character and aesthetics to those around it, and will be a very important contribution to this key gateway to the city. Representatives from Dancor are here if there are any specific questions about the building. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for the applicant? Seeing none, I'd move to the public, see if there's any comments from the gallery. I'll make the first call and the second call. I'll make one final call. No questions from the gallery. I'd seek a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. We'll open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, thank you. I'll look to the committee. Councillor Park.
Thank you. Colleagues, I will not be supporting this application, as I, through my questioning earlier, pointed to the fact that this parcel was sold by the city to the proponent under the guise of the industrial land development strategy. I think that the zoning that we have on this parcel completes that vision that council had for the strategy going forward. I don't see the need for this amount of office space out in the area. The staff presentation spoke about the availability at this point. I also don't see it as a good measure for the downtown when we have an incredible vacancy rate in the downtown when it comes to office uses. So that's the rationale behind why I'm not supporting this application.
Councillor Park, further comments? I did have a question, I guess that might come up from Councillor Park's comments. With respect to development charges and development charge incentive programs associated with this site, the portion that's considered commercial is that then I guess would not be eligible for the industrial DC incentives.
Through the chair, that's correct. The DC bylaw does give the chief building official the ability to proportion development charges based on the use and the definitions that are in the bylaw.
Thank you. Any further comments or discussion? Seeing none, I would take a motion on this file. Have the staff recommendation. Councillor Cassidy's moved it. Looking for a seconder. It's been seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any further discussion at this time? Seeing none, I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-1.
Okay, thank you, committee. We will move on to item 11 for a public participation meeting. Application by Nicholas DePardo with respect to the property located at 2081 Trafalgar Street. Welcome, Ms. Wise.
Thank you. This application is for a zoning bylaw amendment. 2081 Trafalgar Street is located in the east part of the city. This site is located between Clark Road and the Veterans Memorial Parkway, just south of Trafalgar Street. The site is fairly squarish in shape and size. There's 60 meters frontage along Trafalgar Street. And then there's also a portion that has frontage along Cartier Road to the southeast portion of the site. There's just over 3,000 square meters of lot area. The site has 2.5 to 3-story low-rise apartments to the east and is surrounded by low-density residential neighborhood to the south and to the west. And to the north side of Trafalgar Street, there's an additional medium-density residential form with mainly townhouses and street townhouses. So this is looking at the south frontage of Trafalgar Street. You can see the 2.5 to 3-story form to the east and the surrounding residential neighborhood. There was a single detached dwelling and a shed that were constructed circa 1908 that have since been demolished, so the site is currently vacant. So this is the existing form of the site. Again, this is the apartment building, and you can see the a perimeter maintained that's vegetated, but the rest of the site is vacant. And this is showing the Cartier Road frontage from the other side. So this is the extent of the frontage. And there's also a mature hedge that's currently there, which is proposed to be retained. The proposed development is to facilitate severance. This site is within the low-density residential designation, and the request is for an R32 zone. There would be 4 lots created, each with a duplex, custom-built duplex on site, with the intention to allow for future conversion to a triplex through converting the lower level. There's 2 shared accesses coming from Trafalgar Street and then parking in the rear. This is the proposed conceptual rendering from the front. Looking at our policy framework, it's consistent with the provincial policy statement as it promotes infill and intensification within settlement areas. It also encourages a variety of housing options and forms to meet projected needs and targets densities and land uses to efficiently use infrastructure and public service facilities. Looking to the official plan, it's consistent with the low-density residential policy, specifically those that allow for residential intensification. Those policies allow for a broader range of uses, including cluster housing, low-rise apartments, and attached dwellings. The residential intensification policies also allow for a density of up to 75 units per hectare. And in this case, if the 4 triplexes were fully built out, it would result in a density of 37 units per hectare. And looking to the London plan, the site is within the neighborhood's place type and located along a civic boulevard. In this location, there's a range of residential uses contemplated, including duplexes up to low-rise apartments. And the form is targeted at a minimum of 2 stories, up to 4 stories in height. And what we're looking for is a 2.5-story form, so well within that. I just wanted to make note of one change from the initial design to the final design. Looking at the rear yard, where the green border is, there was initially an overparking of the site, so there was more parking spaces provided than what the zoning bylaw required. And since then, 1 space has been removed, which seems minor, but has had really positive cascading effects. So one thing is that there's a larger and more functional amenity space. That's in addition to what's provided at the rear of the building. Now there's also another space provided at the rear of the lot. There is the full amount of parking provided, and a special provision that was requested for an increased parking coverage is now no longer needed. And the third benefit is that this now provides an enhanced buffer to the property to the south, which was the closest single detached dwelling. The recommendation is for an R32 zone. The special provision on the eastern side is to recognize that instead of Cartier Road being the frontage, Trafalgar Road would be interpreted by our zoning bylaw to be the frontage. All other zoning bylaw requirements have been met. This particular application represents a desirable and appropriate infill and also an appropriate transition from the low to medium density residential uses in the area. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a vote open to call the public participation meeting to order. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Park. The vote is open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, and I'll look to the committee to see if there's any questions of technical nature for Ms. Wise. Seeing none at this time, I would look to see if there's a representative from the applicant. Welcome. State your name and application representation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of committee. My name is Casey Kolchicki. I'm a planner with Zelenka Priamo Planning Consultants. I'm representing the applicant, Nicholas DePardo, who is in attendance at tonight's meeting as well. I don't have anything to add to Ms. Wise's presentation. I just wanted to say that we have reviewed the staff report and are in agreement with its recommendation. We would like to thank Ms. Wise and planning staff for working with us through the ZBA process, and we look forward to working with development services through the site plan process. I am available if there are any specific questions regarding the project. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Now I would look to the committee. Any questions for the applicant or the applicant's representative? Any questions from the public? I'll call once. Any other submissions from the public? Twice. Seeing none on the third call, I'll take a motion to close the public participation. Welcome. Just under the wire. Come on down. If you could just state your name and address. If you're uncomfortable with that, the clerk can come and
My
get
name
that
is
from you.
Sandra Martin. I live directly south of the proposed. And I guess my initial reaction was when it was proposed to me and I had called the city was they were going to open up Cartier and go into the rear of that. So the only thing I can say is that as long as that does not happen, you will not hear from me. Because the address is Trafalgar Street and I think that's kind of where it should be. It's been like that forever. So that was my only concern, is that Cartier Road does not open into the, what I classify as to the rear of that property. Okay?
Thank you. Any further questions or members of the public to speak? I'm looking thoroughly this time. Seeing none, I'll take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. The vote's open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Great, thanks. Any questions or comments from the committee? Councillor Park.
Thank you. Through you to Ms. Wise, just to alleviate some concern of Ms. Martin, there's no opportunity to open the rear of the property onto Cartier at this point, correct?
Ms. Wise.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it was something that we were contemplating early on in the review. This is an interesting part of Trafalgar. If you look at both the north properties and properties to the east, they all empty out onto a local road, so they don't have direct frontage to Trafalgar. And that was in an effort through our considerations to justify the amount of accesses on the arterial. So it was contemplated, but because the site didn't have full frontage at the back for Cartier, it would have resulted in numerous and complex easements if there was to be just access for Cartier. So it was also not desirable by the applicant to pursue that, but it was an option, yes.
Further? Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you. I just have a quick comment and a question. I'm sort of pleased with this application here, especially that the parking space was reduced and the additional landscaping and amenity was put in, because one of the concerns from the community also was about the parking and the privacy and the fencing and all that. So I would hope that that would help out, but I would like to know if it would be addressed through the site plan process as well, the fencing and the privacy issues, or are we just basically confirming it tonight?
Ms. Wise.
Through you, Mr. Chair, certainly that's something that the site plan approval process would deal with. It has been indicated up front that because the perimeter of the site is well vegetated on the south and east portion, that's the applicant's direction to maintain those. The west portion has existing wood board-on-board fence, which is also proposed to be retained. So if the hedge is deemed to be in good quality and desirable to maintain, possibly enhance with future plantings, that could provide adequate or even superior screening to board-on-board fence, but that'll all be detailed through site plan.
Any further questions? Seeing none, I think this reflects a good use of land, a good intensification. It's good scale. It's supported by the community through the community association. Those are good factors. There's a lot of good in there, but the proposal seems quite reasonable, and I think we'll call the vote if I don't see anything further. So I would look for a motion, probably on the staff recommendation. It's up. It's been moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Park. No further comments? Seeing none, we'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. And we'll move on to item number 12, which is application by Kenmore Homes for the property located at 255, South Carriage Road. We'll look for a vote to open the public participation meeting. It's been moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, and welcome, Mr. Smith.
Hello, yeah, as you indicated, this is an application at 255 South Carriage Road. This is a subdivision that has been kicking around since 2008. There was a draft approval that went through an OB process on a appeal for some conditions about some cost sharing of road things and such as that. So draft approval didn't occur until 2013. At that time, the full subdivision was a small lot subdivision with predominantly small lot frontages less than 11 meters. And there was no multifamily blocks on the subdivision at that time. And there was also two P-loops that accumulated at the stormwater management pond in that design. During the applicant came in 2016 for revisions and rezonings to allow for a subdivision that was had larger lots, so that we didn't require parking plans, and also that introduced the multifamily blocks for the street townhouses to provide for a better mix of forms of residential dwellings in this area. We came forward with a recommendation for revised draft approval as well as zoning to include for the blocks. Please note that block 96 was subject to a special provision during the original rezoning application, which only allowed for one-story single detached homes on that block. And during the rezoning for the revised plan, block 96 also has a special provision that requires it to be only one story. I've made sure that the people at the Condominium Corporation 611 received the notice of application as well as the proposed revisions, and assured them completely that block 96 was not part of this rezoning for the coverage. They seem to be content with the fact that the coverage is okay. For the actual revision itself is to allow for 10% extra. What didn't occur in 2016 at the time of the extension of draft approval and the revision of the subdivision was that we didn't actually put pen to paper sufficiently on the blocks and go through a pre-consultation for site plan approval. During that pre-consultation for site plan approval, it was discovered that some of these blocks needed a bit of extra coverage to allow for the units that they were proposing. The proposed units are a 3-bedroom unit, and essentially that the difficulty would be that it wouldn't be able to fit into this location. They need the extra coverage. All other criteria of the zone, the R4 zone, do meet, and the fact that 45% coverage in the R1 zone is not unusual in this area as well. So the coverage is pretty consistent with the form of development in the area. This is what is being proposed as a typical on the blocks, and you can see typically about 6 townhouses with the rear yards that are sufficient in size to be accommodate for amenity space, as well as driveways and frontages that are large enough that would also cover for street trees and things like that. So it will fit within the neighborhood, provide for that balance of housing types, and is an appropriate amendment to allow for this form of development to go. So basically, under the planner, speak, development is consistent with provincial policy statements and with the community plan. It provides for that mix of housing and allow for a form of development that is appropriate at this location. So I'll leave it at that for any questions.
Great, thank you, Mr. Smith. Look to the committee for any questions of technical nature. Mr. Helmer, Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. So could you remind me how tall the townhouses are proposed to be? How many stories?
The townhouses have a 12-meter maximum, which is consistent with the heights that are on the R1 zone.
Any further questions? Okay. Seeing none, is a representative from the applicant here. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's somewhat serendipitous that I'm here wearing two hats tonight, but thank you very much for having my students again. And I would just like to say that the applicant is in complete agreement with Mr. Smith's analysis and recommendation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I would look to the public. Are there any submissions from the public? Any opportunities to discuss? None of the students wish to weigh in and object. I'll make my first call, the second call, and the third call for the public. Seeing none from the gallery, I'll take a motion to close the public participation meeting. I've got a motion from Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. The vote is open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, committee. I'll look to you for questions or comments. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. Perhaps to save the chair from doing it himself, we certainly have dealt with a lot of lot coverage variations over the past few years on planning committee. And it does seem like something we should be reviewing in general. If we want to have greater lot coverage and it's proving to not be problematic, I'm not sure that we need to have applications coming forward all the time and zoning amendments requested for that specific change. I'm also increasingly skeptical that we should be going to this kind of lot coverage. There's other ways of adding floor space to residential buildings, and you do that by going upwards. So, if you want to put more bedrooms in, make the building a bit taller. And I'm not sure from a land use perspective whether these kind of lot coverage variations are wise in the long run. I'm not convinced it's a huge problem. I think it's probably fine, and I've supported many of them in the past. But I do think it's one where, if that's where we're trending to, we're going to have greater and greater lot coverage from the buildings. I think what we might end up with is slightly shorter and squatter looking buildings in built form, which is maybe not what we're hoping for. So I just raise it because I'm pretty sure that the chair would have raised it if I didn't. And also because I think it's something that not for this specific application, I think it's fine, and I'm going to support the zoning amendment. But I do think that it's a bigger conversation which we should probably be having at committee.
Thank you, Councillor Helmer. Any further comments? Seeing none, perhaps from the chair, just to echo Councillor Helmer's comments, if you'd allow me. I did have an opportunity to ask staff about that particularly, and one of the answers that came forward, and I thought was rather reasonable, was the question of what was being provided in amenity space, and that there was not a reduction in amenity space. It was maintained at 35%, which was helpful in this circumstance. We're not talking about bungalows, which is another circumstance where I'm concerned concerned about lot coverage, and we're just allowing that form to have high coverage of the lot. But I agree with Councillor Helmer's comments that on the broader policy basis, it makes a lot more sense for us to look at that and look at circumstances as a right rather than looking for amendments every time that a lot coverage requirement was requested. How do we find that formula? If it's a question of ratio to amenity space to lot coverage, is that what we're talking about? And perhaps that can be addressed better. So without any further comments, I don't see any, I would entertain a motion from the committee. Staff recommendation has been put forward, moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Helmer. Any further comments? Seeing none, I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, committee, and we'll move on to item number 13. With respect to a public participation meeting for application by 2479429er, Ontario Inc., located at property 220 Adelaide Street South. And I will take a motion to open the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Park, seconded by Councillor Helmer. I'll open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
And welcome, Ms. Knierim.
This is an application we have for 220 Adelaide Street South. So the property is on Adelaide Street South. It's north of Commissioners. It's currently occupied by Sebastian's Bakery and a vacant unit to the front of it. It's across the street. You have a car dealership. To the north, you have Lovers at Work office furniture sort of warehouse. To the rear, you have low-rise residential. To the south, you have the Glencairn Community Resource Center. And then sort of further south, you have some sort of auto-oriented retail. So a bit about the property at a glance. Site's approximately 1/3 of a hectare. So it's zoned light industrial in an LI1. In the official plan, it's in the light industrial designation. And in the London plan, it's in the light industrial place type. So the applicant came in to change the LI1 zone initially to a compound LI1, LI3 zone, which was intended to permit assembly halls, commercial recreation establishments, daycare centers, private clubs, and private park uses, in addition to the uses that are currently permitted. Working with the applicant, given that broad range of uses, we ended up just narrowing it to a special provision to permit a commercial recreation establishment, keeping that LI1 place type, because what they're proposing to put in is a commercial recreation establishment, and that it would also permit the other uses currently permitted on the site. So this is just the applicant's proposal. You'll see here there's the existing bakery, there's all the existing parking, and then there's the proposed fitness center, which is currently vacant. So in terms of the issues, one issue we looked at is whether or not the commercial recreation establishment is an appropriate use. In terms of the PPS, it's consistent with the PPS that talks about a range of uses, and it's about preserving employment areas. This continues to preserve them. In the official plan, it conforms to the 1989 official plan, which talks about having a range of uses in light industrial areas, including commercial recreation establishments, which are permitted subject to a planning impact analysis, which this met the criteria. It's not a permitted use in the light industrial place type in the London plan, but it would be permitted in the commercial industrial place type in the London plan. So coming out of that, recommendation that we had, which you'll see in our recommendations, is that the subject site and the adjacent site at 244 Adelaide Street South be evaluated to determine if the commercial industrial place type, rather than the light industrial place type, may help to better guide future development on these sites. Just a request for us to be looking at this because the property at 244 Adelaide Street South is currently occupied by the Glencairn Community Resource Center, neither of which are permitted uses in the light industrial place type. This wouldn't need a municipal comprehensive review because commercial industrial place types are employment areas in the London plan. So that's the request that we have to have staff further analyze that. So you'll see here, these two properties are both light industrial place types in the London plan, surrounded by the purple, which is the commercial industrial place type. So just sort of looking into that a little further. So it's recommended that the zoning bylaw amendment be adopted to change the zoning of the subject site from a light industrial zone to a light industrial special provision zone, with a special permission to permit the commercial recreation establishment in addition to the other uses that are permitted on the site. And we also, staff have the recommendation that staff be directed to consider an amendment to the London plan place type for the property at 220 Adelaide Street South and the property immediately to the south at 244 Adelaide Street South. So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd look to any questions from the committee. Seeing none at this time, I have a quick question. Just with respect to the London Plan Amendment proposal for 244, that not being part of the subject application site, I'd imagine prior to doing so, discussions with the property owner would take place, and that would be brought forward at that time.
Yeah, we'd have discussions with the property owner, and we'd also go out to the community for consultation too.
Fantastic, thank you. Is the applicant here, and are you in agreement with the recommendations?
Committee, sorry, thank you. Jay McGuffin, Vice President, Principal Planner, Monteith Brown Planning Consultants, here on behalf of the owner of the subject property. I'd just like to thank staff for the excellent presentation. We're in support, our client is in support of the first of the recommendation, Part A, being the rezoning to a special light provision. Just like to mention to committee, there are other LI, L3 compound zone properties within this light industrial designation on Adelaide Street to the north on the west side with uses including, I think, commercial recreation as well as daycare centers. There was a concern that this on this property that was brought forward by staff that a daycare center may not be considered appropriate in this location. And so our client agreed to remove all of the other permitted uses within the LI3 zone, go to an LI1 special provision to just add in the proposed commercial recreation facility onto the property. So our client does have concerns with respect to the review of the London plan and how that will proceed. I will note that limited commercial uses are permitted in the London plan in the light industrial designation, and that the LI L3 compound zone to the northwest where Danson, there's a dance studio / the daycare facility, is also located in the London plan in the light industrial designation and zone for both the LI1 and LI3 zone. The concern our client would have would be what the implications to the range of permitted uses that would occur on the property would be. And I would just request that while this may be going to the public, if it is part of a larger review of the London plan policies, that specific notice be given to our clients so they have an opportunity to review and comment specifically.
Thank you. And I would look to staff for a response to that if possible before moving forward.
Mr. Chair, the recommendation here is to review these two specific properties as part of a future London plan amendment. So certainly the applicant, the property owner, would receive notification of that.
Thank you. Okay. And I look to the committee for any questions of the applicant. Seeing none at this time, I would look to committee in the gallery, or to the community in the gallery. Any members from the public wishing to make comment on this application? And a second time, I've seen none. And with a third time, last call. Seeing no members of the public to speak to this, I would take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Park. The vote's open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, and I'd look to the committee for any questions, comments. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, Yeah, just a follow-up to the recommendation, V in particular, that we are looking at changing the London plan. Understand notices and the implications to do that will be, I guess the community will be notified. Is that going to be a public participation meeting as well?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it certainly would be, and it would be a full public participation process and may allow it in a public meeting. That's correct.
Thank you. Any further comments? Seeing none, I'd take a motion. Staff recommendations up there. Councillor Park moves it. Councillor Hopkins seconds it. I'll call a vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. And we're moving on to item 14 now, which is the application by Steve Pinal with properties located at 644 and 646 Huron Street. Welcome back. I'll take a motion to open the public participation meeting. It's been moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by someone. Councillor Hopkins. We'll open the vote.
Yep, oh, perfect.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. Ms. Kinnear, welcome.
Okay, thank you. So this is a zoning bylaw amendment application that we had at 644 to 646 Huron Street. So the property is on Huron Street, just east of Adelaide Street. So the subject site is currently occupied by a single detached dwelling and a low-rise apartment building. To the north, we have 6 to 10-story apartment buildings. To the east, we have emergency crisis care establishment. To the south, we have a mixture of sort of single detached dwellings and house form buildings that are occupied by commercial and office uses. We also have some convenience commercial uses. And then to the west of the subject site, we have a 3-story low-rise apartment building and some other convenience commercial uses. So a little bit about the property at a glance. It's multifamily high-density residential in the official plan. It's neighborhoods place type on a civic boulevard, and the zoning is restricted office R01. So the nature of the application is to change the zoning from a restricted office R01 zone to a residential R9 special provision zone with special provisions to for an interior. So essentially that would permit the development of medium and high density residential uses, such as an apartment building with a maximum height of 13 meters, so approximately 3 to 4 stories. Special provisions are for a minimum interior side yard setback of 2 meters when a minimum of 5.2 is required, a minimum front yard setback of 2 meters where 8 is required, and a maximum height of 13 meters. So the applicant's proposal, they're proposing to retain the existing 2-story building and construct 2 new 3-story buildings with 32 units, so a density of 97 dwelling units per hectare and 47 parking spaces. So here's some of the elevations they submitted for the buildings they're proposing. Issues we looked at, one is use. Is the requested low-rise apartment use appropriate? It's consistent with the PPS in terms of a range and mix of residential uses. It also conforms to the official plan, as both the 1989 official plan and the London plan have low-rise apartments as a range of permitted uses, and they fit within the context, which has a mix of low-rise apartments and also taller apartments up to 10 stories in the surrounding area. In terms of height, the applicant has requested 13 meters, which is 3 or 4 stories. And then This also is consistent with the PPS and conforms with the official plan in terms of being sensitive to the surrounding context and is within the range of permitted heights in the London plan for that place type. Another consideration in terms of form was the requested reduction of front yard setback to 2 meters. So this is actually consistent with our official plan, or conforms to the official plan and the London plan, in the sense that they talk about having a minimal setback from the public right-of-way, just to really make up for that comfortable pedestrian environment. Another consideration is the requested interior side yard setback. The applicant requested 2 meters, but we looked at it and we are instead recommending that 2 meters up to a height of 3 stories. And then they'd be required to do an additional setback of 1 meter for every story above the 3rd story. This is intended just to give some additional space to the adjacent properties should they redevelop in terms of privacy, light, etc. Another consideration we had was the site development. The Urban Design Peer Review Panel, they looked at the project and they had several sort of detailed design issues that will need to be resolved through the site plan approval process. So what we're recommending is that there's certain matters that be considered through the site plan approval process, including provision of a primary entrance of new buildings with frontage on Huron Street, building design that differentiates the ground floor, building design that helps to break up the massing. And there's also a Reed drain storm sewer that crosses the property, and it's not known yet whether or not that is active, but that's something that we'd be requesting they look at through the site plan process. And if it's inactive, look at consolidating the 2 buildings into 1 building. And then it's also recommended that they return to the Urban Design Peer Review Panel through the site plan application process. In terms of intensity, they're proposing 32 units, which is 97 units per hectare, and it fits within the official plan requirements for the multifamily high-density residential designations of less than 150 units a hectare, and it is consistent with the London plan in terms of growing inwards and upwards. So we got some community feedback. There were certain concerns in terms of height, traffic impact, and potential land use conflicts with the adjacent emergency care facility. But then we also did hear some general support for the proposal. So in terms of the staff recommendation, we're recommending to change the zoning bylaw, or the zoning on the property from a restricted office to residential R9 special provision zone with a maximum height of 13 meters. Reduce front yard setback of 2 meters with a maximum of front yard setback of 4 meters. An interior side yard setback, a minimum of 2 meters plus 1 additional meter for each story above the 3rd story, and a maximum height of 13 meters. We're also recommending that the Site Plan Control Authority be requested to consider a number of matters through the site plan approval process. And then any future site plan control application be considered by the Urban Design Peer Review Panel, just so that they have additional eyes on it again.
Thank you. I'll look to the committee for any questions of technical nature. Councillor Helmer.
I know the parking requirements are higher than the minimum that's required under the zoning. I was wondering if staff could speak to why that is.
So in, through you, Mr. Chair, in the zoning bylaw, we wouldn't be changing the zoning bylaw requirements, so we're not proposing to require them to provide the additional, but what they're showing is what currently exists on the site with consideration for the new buildings they're proposing. So through the site plan process, that could change, because through the site plan process, they would also be looking at matters in terms of landscaping on site, et cetera.
Further questions? Seeing none, I would look to see if a representative from the applicant is here. Welcome. Do you agree with the recommendations from staff?
I have no comments. As long as it's approved, it's okay.
And you are the applicant? Okay, thank you. All right. I will look to the public to see if there's any comments from the gallery. A couple mics here. 4 of them. Lots of opportunity to speak. Okay. Seeing none, I'll make a second call and a third call, and I'll look to the committee to close the public participation meeting. been moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by? Come on, Councillor Hopkins, don't leave me hanging. Councillor Park, thank you. And I'll open the vote to close the public participation meeting.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, and I'll look to the committee for comments or discussion. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. And first, I want to say to the applicant, thank you for bringing forward a proposal for intensification in this area. It's certainly needed. We need more housing in this area, and this kind of mid-rise apartment building is very good idea for this particular part of the city. I can say to my colleagues that I have heard from some people who live in the area, and they're generally very supportive of the idea. They can see that it's modest intensification, frankly, over what is there now. Really, it's adding 26 units to the 6 that are already on that location, and there's already a lot of rental housing in the area. This is a bit of a different form, and I think people are looking forward to the idea of new buildings coming into that area. I did want to, and I'm glad Councillor Hopkins raised it earlier when we were talking about the variance report and the notification of the tenants, because as I said, this is an area that has quite a few tenants, and just to put it in terms that'll be very clear, the area north of Huron, east of Adelaide, that sort of immediate neighborhood that we're talking about, 98% of the households in that area are tenants. And the area that's south of Huron, east of Adelaide, which includes the shopping plaza and then some residential to the east and the south along Taylor, 76% of the households in that area are tenants. We were talking earlier about notices going out to tenants. That's something we've directed staff to work on and to start doing. And, you know, when the public notice goes out for this particular proposal, basically nobody who lives in this area knows about it other than the sign, right? And if their landlord happens to put something up in a building, or they happen to see us talking about it in public or hear about it some other way. So it is really important that direction that we gave to have notices go out to tenants, because there are thousands of people who live very close to this location, but none of them are here. Not because they'd be against the proposal, but they just don't know that much about it because of the way we do notice now. The property owners get notified and the tenants don't necessarily. So I think that's an important thing we need to work on. This particular proposal, I share some of the concerns that came forward from urban design and some of the things that our staff have articulated around the site plan issues. And I think that those are important to resolve. One building would be, I think, far superior to 2 if that drain is not needed anymore and it's not active. I have some concerns about the amount of hardscaping that's proposed for the site plan. That's a lot of pavement, and it seems like an excess amount of parking, but the existing conditions that are there, and this is something that residents who live in the area have flagged for me, is that there's a shared drive into the apartments that are further back, that are owned by Q Residential, so in behind, further north of this property. And there's an access into 648 Huron Street, which is the 24-hour mental health crisis center run by CMHA. And there's some overflow parking that happens, I think, onto the other property. So this residential property's got a lot of parking, frankly, for what's there right now. And I think there's some people who are parking on the other lot when they need to. If that's not available because this site gets redeveloped and the parking is a bit more controlled, then there's some concern about where the cars will go when the 24-hour crisis center is quite busy. And then that is a concern, I think, that's worth raising. These are all site plan concerns. I know that it's being suggested that there's this advice that goes to site plan, and I support that, so I certainly support the recommendation from our staff. I also support the idea that the urban design peer review panel take a look at the site plan. And I do think that we should put an H5 on so that it comes back to us, because most of the feedback I've had from members of the public is related to the site plan. It has nothing to do with the height of the building or, you know, the number of units. They're not worried about the density. Everything's fine. But it's the specifics of how the property is going to be laid out and work in the existing context that they're interested in. So I know it's another step in the process, but that's something I would suggest as an amendment, that we have an H5 on there, a holding provision to require a public site plan meeting. And I think it will be not controversial. I think it will be relatively easy, but it'll allow us to see what's changed since we saw it here, what's changed from the feedback from the urban design peer review panel. And I think it would just be that much more rigorous of an approach for what is an important part of the city that needs to be intensified in the right way. So I do support the recommendation. I'd like to see the H5 as well.
Thank you, Councillor Helmer. Further discussion, committee? None? Oh, Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, through you to Councillor Helmer for bringing that up. I would definitely support that. And I also want to echo his comments on the urban design peer review panel. I'm glad to see that it going back to them for further review. And I do, as I said, I like the idea of it coming back here just for one final check.
Thank you. So up there we have the staff recommendation. Oh, Councillor Hopkins, do you want to speak?
Yes, has it been changed to the amendment with the holding?
I was just about to see if we might be able to put that forward. Councillor Helmer wished to put the amendment to put the H5 requirement into the application. So I would imagine that would be a D clause. And while we're waiting for that, Councillor Hopkins, were you going to speak to that? Councillor Helmer?
Sorry to not be really explicit, but we'll need a revised bylaw that has the holding provision. And so probably A needs to change to say the revised bylaw, including an H5, come to council. So.
Thank you,
Hopefully
Councillor.
the clerks can figure it all out. Thank you.
For the gallery, this is the sausage making time as we go through making policy. It just takes a second. And now it's up here on Clause A. The end of Clause A states to include a holding provision to include a public site plan. As I see that, I would look for a mover. Moved by Councillor Helmer and seconded by Councillor Cassidy. Look for any other discussion from the committee. Seeing none at this time, I would call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. So we move on to item 15, I believe, which is with respect to a staff report for an application by Horacium Homes for the property located at 1900 Kilgerman Way. And there, we also have a request for delegation from Mr. Musa, who I saw here earlier. Great, there we are. So first, I guess we can deal with the report from staff, and then I would look to committee to address the request for delegation afterwards. Councillor Park?
Just wanted to be clear, we'll vote after the delegation on the staff report recommendation.
Correct. So first would be hear the report. Hear the report, approve the delegation status, and then we'll vote on staff recommendation. Perfect. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an application for removal of a holding provision at 1900 Kilgorman Way, and the applicant is Harrison Homes Incorporated, and their consultant is Zelenka Priamo, who I believe are here attending tonight as well. The lot in question is a vacant residential building lot within a registered plan of subdivision, Lot 9, and this was registered in 2015, but it goes back some years before when the subdivision plan was draft approved in 2005, and at the same time the zoning was applied at that time to the subdivision. It's basically a large rural estate lot subdivision and an extension of the what was existing at the time a rural subdivision on Limekiln Road. And it was approved by the Ontario Municipal Board. After annexation, the land use designation that was applied was rural settlement, together with a special policy in the official plan which permitted essentially this subdivision of large estate lots. The zoning that was approved is residential R114, and a holding provision was applied, specifically the H37 holding provision, which implements the provincial minimum distance separation requirements. And the holding provision, this H37, is to be in place until such time as the existing livestock facilities in the area were removed, or that the building infrastructure was removed so as to render the facility not capable of housing livestock. This holding provision applied specifically to two of the lots in the subdivision at the southerly end of the subdivision plan, 1890 and 1900 Kilgorman Way. 1900 Kilgorman Way is identified, highlighted in yellow, and that's the subject of this application request to remove the H. It was applied to recognize the existence of two livestock facilities, one at 254 Gideon Drive, which is immediately to the south of Gideon Drive and east of Woodhall Road. And the other was a facility at 1941 Woodhall Road, which is also identified immediately to the west. The livestock facility at 254 Gideon Drive was removed completely. There are no buildings or structures on that site at the present time. The existing horse farm at 1941 Woodhall Road is identified on this buffer radius map. The MDS radius extends just inside the westerly lot line of the subject lot at 1900 Kilgorman Way. It does not significantly affect any portion of buildable area on the lot or the outdoor amenity area. The adjacent building lot, however, at 1890 Kilgorman Way, is closer to the existing livestock operation and also lies entirely within the MDS1 separation distance. The MDS1 calculations were applied at the time of draft plan approval and approval of the zoning bylaw amendment that applied this holding provision and were accepted. So the existing horse farm can continue to operate as it has been. Any proposals for future alteration, expansion, or relocation of the livestock facility will be required to meet MDS2 separation setbacks. So the staff recommendation is that the condition for removing the holding provision has been met. We recommend approval of the request to remove that H37 symbol from the zoning map for the lot at 1900 Kilgorman Way. The holding symbol will continue to apply to the vacant lot closest to the livestock facility at 1890 Kilgorman Way.
Thank you, Mr. Mottram. I'd look to the committee for any questions, technical nature. I see Councillor, no. Okay, we also have a request for delegation status from Mr. Musa with respect to this application. This is typically the way we've dispensed with these in the past has been to grant delegation status for a subsequent meeting. However, this application has come forward at this time, and the application was with direct reference to his property. So I would seek discussion from the committee whether we wish to grant that status at this time. Councillor Park.
Thank you. I would like to move that we grant delegation status at this meeting.
Thank you. And Councillor Hopkins to second that. So we have a motion on the floor. It's been moved by Councillor Park and seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any discussion about that? Okay. And I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you and welcome, Mr. Musa. The floor is yours. And you have about 5 minutes to present, if you could.
Good afternoon, Mohammed Musa. If I can just start out by saying, with committee's indulgence, I may need more than 5 minutes. I had a presentation set. My office got broken into overnight, and my laptop that it was on, I've got nothing to put on the screen right now. I may have to actually refer to Mr. Mottram's, if I can get into that, to explain with the drawings and such.
We'll grant some leeway, and if we can provide some of Mr. Mottram's slides for Mr. Musa, that would probably be helpful.
Okay. Just want to preface this with a history of this development. 15 years of planning, 5 councils. At no time before what's before you today had anyone questioned the MDS. Had anyone said that it needs to be removed based on whatever factors are being discussed here. The 2 properties that had MDS, the separations, in 2001, my partner and I had a lease on 254 Gideon Drive on both the residential portion and the front 30 acres. I did have livestock at that point there, cattle and horses. In 2003, there was a lease on the agricultural portion and barn at 1941 Woodhull Road that predates my ownership of that. At the time of this application in 2003, I had upwards of 29 head of livestock on 1941 Woodhull Road. That was known at the time. The developer at the time, Ms. Matthews, did not supply. I mean, this is a 15-year process, 5 councils. This is something where it was known at the time, but none of that information as to how many head of livestock were there was put into place or given to staff at the time. It went to OMB, in which case, if I'm not mistaken, the approval authority becomes the OMB in this case. Minutes of settlement were signed at the time, circa 2005, 6. I'm not absolutely sure. I'm going by memory here. There was some certainty given by the MDS the MDS measurements, although they weren't done correctly at the time, and it has not been confirmed at this point with present day staff. Those gave a certainty, and title gave a certainty in my ability to use that livestock operation. In 2012, October of 2012, I purchased the property. This is the original Woodhull property. This is the Woodhull family property. I bought it after 200 years of it being in the Woodhull family. I do have to say that they are friends and continue to be friends. And with the purchase of the property, that was 9 years in the making, they expected me to be steward of the land. I take that quite seriously, and genuinely, that is the way that it has gone. This is not something that has just arisen recently. I have, for 5.5 years, been attempting for all parties involved, attempted to resolve this holding provision. Moving my barn. My difficulty is, if you look at the lines in this, I'm surrounded by OS5s, OS3s. That barn can't go very much further back. And if this holding provision is removed, I will be forever foreclosed from doing what I can do with my property. If I need to move or expand my livestock operation, there are horses now, and it's not a horse farm. It is a livestock farm. I plan on getting cattle again. I'm taking too much time on that. I made a few notes here. What you're being asked to do today is remove a provincial policy. Well, you're being asked to go against provincial policy. Basically, prior to the issuance of any building permit for these, sorry, I'm just going to move my computer a little bit closer here. I made some notes while I was here. MDS has to be met. It's not met. Whether 254, there are no buildings there anymore. The line encumbers at least 1/3 of 1900 Kilgorman Way. This should be simple. In my mind, this should be simple. Conditions precedent have not been met. The MDS has not been met. And I do believe that that should be, rejection, period, full stop, no further discussion, but that's not the way that it works. You have in front of you in the paperwork, PPS 2014 2.3.3.3, new land uses including the creation of lots and new and expanding livestock facilities shall comply with the minimum distance separation formula. It is not. This is provincial policy statement. This is directive. I submit to you that your H37 holding provision has not been met. Your agricultural, protection of agricultural land from development and from encroachment from development has not been met according to the official plan, 1989, and the London plan. Everything's working against this application. I don't see the reason why I'm here other than to, make my case. Revised MDS came into effect on March 1st, 2017. Under the Planning Act, land use planning decisions must be consistent with the PPS after March 1st, 2017. In order to demonstrate consistency with the PPS, land use planning decisions made by municipal planning authorities will need to comply with the revised MDS. This is provincial policy statement. This is your creator. This is what we're here. This is, I'm sorry, I'm a little disjointed right now. A municipality must review the MDS calculations to ensure they are correct. I submit to you that these are far from correct. AgriSuite, which comes from OMAFRA. I've done the calculations. Nobody on staff has. And this is a program that allows you to do it. And I'm sorry, as I said, I wish I had this up on the screen. Using beef cattle, for example. Is this existing maximum number? If I use 22, which is what was there in 2003 when this MDS was put in place, or sorry, subsequently put in place, our MDS calculations work out to 267 meters. At present, it's 133. I'm going to very quickly edit one thing here and put 13, because that's what was used at the time. My MDS calculation comes out to 229 meters. You're being asked to revisit a holding provision that's been on for 15 years. If you're going to do that, let's revisit the calculation of the MDS. The MDS then encumbers 1910. I don't think the builder has basically, realizes that if it must comply, then there should be a holding provision on that as well. I'm sorry, I've probably very much exceeded my time, but
Just,
Just
double
come-
past the time. So we've
I
granted a bit of leeway, but if I might help to just kind of crystallize the comments a bit. Your concerns, as stated, are one, that the MDS calculation hasn't been done consistent with what you think would assign the usage and the MDS calculation under the OMAFRA standards. And the second, that in granting this application, that it would prohibit any movement of the outbuildings and barns within your property to be able to accommodate new uses and to decrease the offense on neighboring properties that you see that. Do you have any other concerns?
Expanding. I would just like to say, with respect to MDS, in December of 2015, Mr. Barrett and Mr. Fleming made a very cogent argument as to why MDSs must be respected. I wish I could show that on screen right now, but I'm just asking for the foresight to not deal with the issues that this council, this committee, and therefore council has had in the past. You've just come out of an OMB appeal with respect to an abattoir, which was as of right. This is not something that I want to get to. I, as that property owner, should not have the onus put on me to have odor protection from lots that really shouldn't be developed at this point. Winds come from the west. These properties are to the east. I'm just asking for some foresight to avoid anything in the future that you guys have had to deal with based on previous things here.
Thank you, Mr. Musa. I'll allow a committee to ask questions and for staff to provide response as well to that.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time. And sorry to hear about your burglary.
Just one last thing. I have to anticipate, it's an unenviable position to have to anticipate, what responses from staff are, but the MDS calculation has not been done. I did have a meeting with Mr. Mottram and Mr. Pompile on January 16th, and I did ask that the MDS calculations be redone.
Okay, we'll have those discussions. Thank you. Councillor Hopper.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation as well. I guess I'll just follow up with the question that was asked by Mr. Musa, through you, Mr. Chair, to staff about have the MDSI requirements been reviewed? Or when was the last time they were reviewed?
These MDS calculations were based on the recommendation at the time of draft plan approval, and there was not an MDS calculation provided by the applicant subdivider at the time. They were performed by staff based on the guidelines in place at that time for MDS1, and estimates of the housing capacity of the various barns in the area were used, and using the MDS guidelines for determining housing capacity and the number of livestock units. The two facilities, Mr. Musa's farm operation, as well as the facility to the south, were calculated. 133 meters was the minimum distance separation, and that was calculated from the main barn on Mr. Musa's property, and it just skirts the southerly corner of the subdivision plan. The other calculation for a much larger livestock facility to the south was based on a 244 meter distance, and that arc of influence profoundly impacted this lot. More than half of the area was impacted and would not be buildable, but it was because that building, those livestock buildings have been removed, that we were of the opinion that there would, as long as the livestock facilities to the west continued on as it as it was, as existing, the status quo, it would not be impacted by the lifting of the H on this site. So the short answer to the question is no, we did not apply MDS the current guidelines. This is based on the MDS application at the time that the zoning and the holding provision was approved by council.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, just to follow up, just so I understand, you're saying the last time the review was done was through the draft approval stage, which I assume was about 15 years ago?
That's right, 2004.
Thank you for that. I just want to follow up with another question that I have, Mr. Chair. And part of my dilemma is that the holding provision was put on to protect the property, and now we're removing it. So I understand now we're constricting the property. And if we do remove it, what are the restrictions to 1941?
If we do remove it, as I had indicated, the existing facility can continue on. If in the future there are proposals for relocation or alteration or expansion of that existing facility, then the onus would be on the proponent to meet the requirements of the minimum distance separation as well. And they're restricted or constrained by the presence of a residential subdivision plan, and as well as other non-farm residential uses in the area. And as Mr. Musa had pointed out, there is a cemetery, Woodhall Cemetery, immediately to the south, which is recognized in the MDS guidelines as a sensitive land use. So it is quite restricted already to be able to expand the operation.
One of the things I heard Mr. Musa say is that right now there are horses, the opportunity to have livestock, which may be the plans for this property. Would they be allowed?
Additional livestock, in addition to what is being housed now? I don't think so. No, not that, no.
Further questions from the committee? Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to staff. What's the zoning currently on 254 Gideon Drive?
I believe the zoning at 254 Gideon Drive is AG2.
Thank you. So that allows for livestock still, even though there's no buildings there right now. If we were to remove this holding provision, would that also affect 254? And even though it's zoned AG2, they would not be allowed to have livestock on at least a portion of that site? Is that correct?
No, the permitted uses are livestock facilities, but subject to meeting provincial MDS requirements. So if a new facility was proposed for that site, they would have to, they wouldn't be able to get a permit unless they provided their calculations, and they would have to recognize the existing subdivision plan. So, yeah, MDS only operates for existing livestock facilities, the MDS1 calculation.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can I ask also, is lot number 1915, has that been developed or?
I don't think that it has been. I don't think that the building permit application has been issued yet for that lot. 1918, yes, that has a house on it. As well as I might point out, 1915, Kilgorman Way is a house, and you'll note that the arc of influence, it just skirts the southwest corner of that lot, and the holding provision was not applied to that lot. So I just wanted to point that out.
So my concern is, Mr. Musa correctly pointed out that we've seen land conflicts come before this council, in this term of council, where we have these agricultural uses in conflict with urban sprawl that we have allowed and past councils have allowed to continue. And my fear is, as we expand out this urban development, we're sanitizing effectively this agricultural land. And I believe 1941 is already restricted because because of the restrictions that they have for expansion to the south, and other reasons, and if the only way to go is north, already they can't do that because of 1915 there. I'm gonna listen to what the rest of the committee has to say, but we're supposed to be protecting agricultural land. And so it's fine to say 1941 is ag land and it's zoned for livestock and there's livestock there right now. But if we are effectively sanitizing this land from being a viable livestock operation, we're doing as much as if we were to allow a subdivision to be built on that agricultural land.
Look to the committee for other comments. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. So in terms of an expansion at 1941, I know we see the MDS 133 meter buffer from the original approval. We have different criteria now for the MDS2, which is about expansions. So if you were going to, improve the facility or change things, it would be a different calculation. Have we done the mapping to show how constrained the property is now from what has already been built? Because the cemetery is like immediately adjacent, right? It's right to the south. And that's going to be a big constraint on the whole property, probably. And going north, as Councillor Cassidy's pointed out, 1915 is under construction or finished. That's a pretty tight constraint that already seems to be hitting the 133 meter buffer. If the buffer is larger, as Mr. Musa is suggesting, then it's kind of a moot point whether that facility can expand. It seems to me like the only thing that can happen is that it can stay the way it is. And it can't really do anything else because it's constrained in the northeast, it's constrained in the south. I don't know if you could go northwest, if that's what is contemplated, if that would work and that's the obstacle. But I don't really understand it. So I guess my question is, have we looked at what the MDS will be for 1941? Even forget 1900, that lot, ignore that one. With what's already there, what are the options? And that's a question for our staff, but I guess it's also a question for Mr. Musa. I mean, it's his property. I'm sure he's done those calculations.
No, the answer is no. We have not gone on into further or deeper analysis into the assumptions or scenarios for what could be done with the 1941 property in terms of livestock facilities, whether it be in an alteration to the facility or a different type of livestock use, or how much of an expansion would be contemplated that would result in the facility being pushed further away. And this is a almost 30-acre lot and has a lot of constraints on it, as it was pointed out by Mr. Musa, with open space to the north, the cemetery to the south. And so we've not gone on to that much analysis, no. But the holding provision is what it is, the way it's worded, and that's how we were proceeding.
And Mr. Musa, would you like to respond to Councillor Helmer's question?
Thank you, through the chair. MDS1 calculations and MDS2 calculations are totally independent of one another. My only option would be to expand to the east, which would be closer to those lots. And the point that I was trying to make is, if there is a residential lot, a lot of record there, then I am foreclosed from putting the barn where it needs to be. And As I said, for 5.5 years, I have been in contact with Realty Services. I've had informal discussions with planning. I have been trying to find a solution to this, and have been at many of these committee meetings in order to see how cemeteries are dealt with in terms of sensitive land use. I do disagree with the fact of I can't expand my facility with more livestock. I can, and I had at the time when this development proposal came up. I had 30 head of livestock there. There are 30 acres. Generally, a rule of thumb is one head of livestock per acre, and the barn will support that. And that's where my big bone of contention has been, is that there was certainty given with that holding provision, and I feel now that was less of a certainty and more of a false sense of security.
Thank you. Councillor Helm.
So without getting into the exact calculation you've done for the MVS2, I realize that they're different formula. That's why which is fair. What do you think the buffer is on the barn that's there now? So if you were to go a bit east, like if you were to build a larger barn, for example, and you went east towards those lots, are you right up against the buffer now? Or do you have any room?
I'm not up against the buffer now. A year ago this week, I had spoken to urban planner at OMAFRA, Drew Crinklaw, as the March 1st, 2017 MDS calculations were being put in place. Got a good education on how that's being done. My difficulty is that it depends on what the expansion is. If my purposes are to have both cattle and horses, which is what my plan is, my difficulty is that I get credit for an existing livestock facility. If I move a portion of that, I can get closer to there. My difficulty is now I've got setbacks from the road, I've got setbacks from the OS5, I've got setbacks from the OS3, and there are ergonomics involved in that as well. You don't want to put a barn back in, close to woods and, on a day like today, have to go through 150 meters of mud, 150 linear meters, horizontal meters of mud to get to your barn. So, as I said, I'm trying to find a decent solution. It's just, this is not it. I mean, I'm being encroached upon here, being backed into a corner. And sorry, if it was 14, I did a rough and dirty calculation. If it was 14 head of livestock with the credit given, I could be within 44 meters of, and a setback of 4.4 meters from the road. And the calculations all happen as to where the livestock is going to be held. If it's on the southern portion, so you take the closest, sorry, I'm done. I'm not gonna try and explain every little nuance of that. It's confusing enough. And as I said, for 14 head, it would be 44, but I'd have to disassemble my livestock facility right now, which is capable of housing, by my calculation, 22 plus some outdoor.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, given that these calculations were done quite a few years ago and things have changed in the area, if the committee would be agreeable with referring this back with new calculations. I'm not sure if that's going to help the applicant or not, but if I could have staff's comment.
Mr. Yeoman.
Through the chair, I would support that referral back. These are important and challenging interfaces. Obviously, we want to make sure we get it right. We believe the numbers that we put before you and the recommendation is correct. We haven't had Mr. Mustafa's calculations as well before tonight, so I think it would be helpful for us to have another conversation with him and then come back to you on March 19th with this.
Thank you for that. So I would like to put that referral back with calculations coming back to us to, I guess, have the debate again. To me, I'm hesitating here because this holding provision was put on the property to allow the facility to operate. We're removing the holding provision and we're constricting the property in 1941. And I feel uncomfortable about that. I would like to see if there's other alternatives before we make a decision on 1941. And given that 254, this was done a number of years ago, there's no longer a livestock facility there too. So things are getting a little bit muddied for me a bit, and would appreciate the committee's support.
Okay, we have a motion for referral and seek a seconder on that. Okay, and I see a nod from that. Any discussion on the referral? Councillor Helmer.
I think it's wise, and I look forward to coming back soon. I do think we get into a situation where there's conflicts like this between uses, and my preference is to protect the agricultural use. But, you know, the situation we're in right now is sort of whoever builds first is going to constrain the other party. And, you know, I think that the 254 has already changed and there's nothing happening there, but there could be something that happens there. Somebody could build there and they could have, and then there's an MDS that cuts into this lot again. So as long as it's not a huge amount of time that's passing, I think that that's fair. I think it's worth looking at the numbers really closely to see how constrained things are now and what opportunities there are or aren't. We didn't approve this subdivision, this particular planning committee, but we are dealing with these couple lots that are left with the H37s, and I think we need to be careful. I wouldn't want to rush on something like this.
Yep, I agree.
Just if I might, with respect to some of that, so a very good discussion. I think this is a really essential one. The conflicts and tension that occurs when we do planning and addressing is often that interface between the urban and rural divide. And in this circumstance, this completely underscores that. I had a few questions. Perhaps they can be answered now. Perhaps they can be answered back in the referral. But we had that discussion about creating the MDS. And if I look at the MDS-1, it provides the minimum distance separation between proposed and new development and existing livestock or agricultural uses. And the MDS-2 is for the calculation between any remodeling of the agricultural operation and existing development. And so those, we've also heard from Mr. Musa, who talked about the desire or the intent to create a change in usage of his property, at which point that would trigger the MDS-2 calculations. But right now, in terms of the application, we apply the MDS-1 criteria. So kind of an exploration of that would be really helpful. The second would be, Mr. Mottram talked about how we were using the calculations and the separations distances of the day. One of the things that we asked for early on was a question of applying the rules and framework of the day now, not the day when those applications came forward. So specifically when that discussion came forward, it was with respect to environmental regulations, but I think agricultural recommendations certainly fall into line with that, so that the PPS comes into play now, the AMAFRA standards and MDS comes into play, the environmental standards and buffer distances, all of those things, when looking at an application, they're looked at through the lens of current day planning policies, not 15-year-old policies. The question Councillor Cassidy brought up and was a big question mark for me is how 1915 came to be built. In the arcs that are presented by staff, 1915 is absolutely within the arc of the MDS, and if that arc were to exist, then, and when I take a look at the Google Maps, I see a foundation there. It should not have come to pass if that MDS is there. So how did that come to be? And in that report back, I think it would be really important to see the calculations and which methods, MDS-1, MDS-2, and how that ran through a current day MDS calculation. Are those easily achievable within what would come back in the report?
Through the chair, those are all very good points, and we'll definitely be providing information and clarification on those with the referral back on the 19th.
Okay, thanks. I would look to committee to see if there's any further discussion Okay, so we have a referral back on this, and I think I think from my understanding and what I see from staff is that they will have that thorough discussion with Mr. Musa, as well as the applicant on Kilgerman, to determine how that best plays out, and we'll look forward to your report back. Without any further discussion seen, we have a motion. It's been moved by Councillor Helmer and seconded by Councillor Cassidy. I will open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, thank you. And with that, that brings us to deferred matters or additional business, which is number 16, a delegation from Ms. Wally, the Vice Chair of the London Advisory Committee on Heritage. Welcome, Ms. Wally, and happy Heritage Week. Heritage Week is celebrated as the third week in February provincially in Ontario, and it's started by a Federal Heritage Day, which I believe was yesterday, if that's correct. And we also had a Heritage Fair on the weekend at the library. So thank you for your contributions to heritage, and we welcome your report today.
Thank you very much. We also had the Heritage Awards last week too, so it's been a big week for heritage. Come to give you the report from the last Latch committee meeting. We met on February the 14th, Valentine's Day. Got some nice cookies from City Hall. We did. We received a delegation from WSP Consultants on the heritage implications of the BRT plans for London. Jenny Ramsey and Stephen Jarrett presented a cultural heritage screening report to us, which is a way of trying to identify the properties that will be affected by the planned routes. It's basically looking to see which properties might have heritage potential. So those are those which accord with CHVI, cultural heritage value or interest, as determined by the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, or are more than 40 years old. Those that fit these criteria will require further CHERs, cultural heritage assessment reports, evaluation reports, sorry. Those properties that are already designated and listed do not need further research, obviously. The other properties in question it's 421 properties. So these were referred to the Stewardship Subcommittee of Latch, which will be augmented by the entire Latch Committee, as there's so many of them, and we have to do it quite quickly. So that was the gist of the report and what we're about to do with it. We did receive the report of the Planning and Policy Subcommittee of Latch. This involved a letter to be sent to the Environmental and Climate Change Canada, supporting item 11 of report 10 of the Federal House of Commons Standing Committee on the Environment and Sustainable Development. Item 11 refers to a proposed tax credit for restoration and preservation work on buildings listed in the Canadian Register of Historic Places. This list does include 71 properties in London. However, this list is somewhat out of date. Not our fault, but it is. So we passed motions supporting sending a letter of that, but also noting that it is not in any way a comprehensive list of historic buildings in London. We received the 2017 Heritage Planning Program from the Heritage Planners. There will be a new issue of the postcard, which I think you've all received, that will be sent out to every household in the seven heritage conservation districts, reminding them of the need for a heritage alteration permit for various renovations and additions, restorations, that kind of thing. London has currently 7 HCDs, 334 individually designated properties, 1,964 heritage listed properties, and 1 cultural heritage landscape. 228 properties were added to the register, which is the inventory of heritage resources, in 2017. 111 in the Great Talbot HCD, and 79 in the Gibbons Park HCD, and 38 in London East Industrial Area. The Archaeological Management Plan 2017 will replace the Archaeological Master Plan, which was written in 1996. 81 heritage alteration permits were processed in 2017. Some have to come to Latch and Municipal Council, and some just received delegated authority approval, and that was 73 that came to the city planner. This represents a 305% increase in the number of heritage alteration permits since 2014, partly because there are more HCDs and partly because of greater awareness on behalf of the people who live in them. 4 properties were removed from the register and demolished. 2 demolitions were denied by Municipal Council, and 7 properties in HCDs received demolition approval with terms and conditions. And that is the sum of my report. Happy Heritage Week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wally. Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you to the Latch. My folks deal with them on a very regular basis. The heritage planners have done an amazing amount of work, but so has Latch. It's been a heavy workload, and they've given up a lot of their personal time in order to provide the service to council and citizens of London, so I thank them.
Thank you. I'll look to the committee for questions, comments. Councillor Helmer.
I can say as the recipient of one of the postcards, they work quite well. Good reminder that heritage alteration permits are required and necessary.
Any further questions? Councillor Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a question, but I guess an amendment I'd like to make it so that Municipal Council indeed does endorse Part 11 from the Community Heritage Foundation letter talking about federal tax grants for the restoration and preservation of buildings listed on the Canadian Register of Historic Places. So the letter was seeking council endorsement of the whole, but I think Part 11 is something we can certainly agree on today.
Yeah, and that was going to be my questioning ultimately was a question of whether staff had had a chance to review the recommendations, if they were in alignment with municipal policies. The piece on 11 is one. Number 10 I had taken a look at, and where did the $10 million come from as a set number? And perhaps that's a question we might be able to ask Ms. Wally as well, but before I step in. Any further comments? Then perhaps I would go to staff with respect to the letter. We have been requested to endorse the recommendations numbering 17 in the letter to the federal government, and to see if there's alignment with municipal policy, if we have any concerns in there that might be out of alignment with municipal policy.
Thank you. Through the chair, this is related to the failure of Bill C-323 in federal parliament in the fall, I believe November, and that was a private member's bill that was trying to obtain tax rebates for heritage restoration work. So this is, I think, a movement by the heritage community to try to encourage perhaps a future government or maybe a sitting government in the majority to sponsor such legislation. So what we're seeing here is a response to that and in further encouragement. Staff did have the opportunity to review this. My colleague Laura Dent was unable to be here tonight, but did work with the Policy and Planning Subcommittee of the Latch in the preparation of this letter, and it does align with our municipal policies. One concern that we did have that was shared with other heritage planners in Ontario was the restriction to the Canadian Register of Historic Places. This was a federal initiative from around 2007 to 2009, where there was money available to support the sharing of information related to historic buildings in different communities across Ontario. That funding ended, and no buildings or properties have been added to that list since that time. The authority has been delegated to the provinces, who also have no funds to support adding properties to that list. This applies in a lot of jurisdictions, unlike Ontario, where we have a very robust Heritage Conservation Act. We can designate properties at the municipal level, and that's much more challenging to achieve, particularly in the territories, I understand. So this was undertaken as a way to represent buildings of heritage value or properties of heritage value in a pan-Canadian perspective. The heritage planners in Ontario have articulated concerns to restricting this just to buildings listed on the Canadian Register of Historic Places, whereas those designated under the Ontario Heritage Act or other such legislation in different provinces may be more appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gagnon. I appreciate that. So you did raise a point in there that that begs the question: if this were enacted on the federal government level, would it conflict in any way with the municipal designation process? Would it create two separate streams for designation? And could it, I guess, create two different opportunities for designation that might be sought? Strange way to phrase it, and I don't mean it to come out this way, but let's say a municipal council chose not to do the designation, and then someone were to seek federal designation. I'd imagine that would supersede municipal council's desires.
Through the chair, there is no designation at the federal level that will protect a building from alterations. Only those properties in federal ownership can be protected by any federal heritage programs. All of the properties that are listed in London on the Canadian Register of Historic Places are designated either under Parts 4, 5, or both of the Ontario Heritage Act. So the current status is looking good in terms of what properties could be eligible. As I mentioned before, we'd be, from a professional perspective, wanting to see all properties designated under the Ontario Heritage Act to be eligible for this. I think your question related to the two different statuses that may be encountered if a property is listed on the Canadian Register of Historic Places but not municipally designated. I think that's a challenge that we'll have to implement if we ever get into that situation, but it is paralleled by some of the confusion that we have with property owners regarding listed on our register, the inventory of heritage resources versus designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. I think that's related to our efforts in engagement and outreach, like those postcards we send for Heritage Week. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So if I were to get that right, I think the sense is that this would help with creating inventories that might be maintained on a national level. Ultimately, the disposition and consideration of those remains in municipal autonomy and would continue to do so. Thank you. So I would look to the committee for, Councillor Park spoke with specific recommendation to 11, but I'm not sure if we wanted to endorse the recommendations as a whole. As the staff or the recommendation here, I think, incorporates all of that. If we were to bring that forward, is that correct? Yes. So as that says, they would take all the recommendations from the Latch report and adopt them as the committee's recommendation. Councillor Helmer.
I'd ask that you pull that clause separately, and I just have a few comments. So this is one where I haven't really made up my mind about whether this is a good idea. There's two components to what has been proposed. One is a tax credit for rehabilitation costs. The other one is a deduction. I would need to see some more analysis around, what that marginal impact of that kind of credit and deduction proposal is going to be, what the cost of it would be. And generally speaking, I think we have to be very careful about talking about federal tax policy at municipal council. So it could be very expensive. The credit side is 20% of the rehab costs. The rehab costs are defined to include a lot of different costs. And for any given building, I think that could be fairly expensive. For the deductions, that's a much more significant thing where you can deduct from your taxable income the rehabilitation costs. The first part, I think it's broken into years, 25% in the first taxation year, 50% the next one, and 25% for the third year. So that can reduce your taxable income a lot, and depending on the strategies that people are employing, especially sophisticated people who have a lot of money and own a lot of buildings, that can save them a lot of taxes. The problem is that we need taxes and tax revenue to pay for things that the federal government does that are important things. So I think when we're looking at tax credits and especially tax deductions, those have to be weighed against all the other priorities that the federal government has. I do think that financial incentives to support reinvestment in heritage resources is an important thing, and I think there could be a way to do it that would be effective at the federal level. So for example, I might support the tax credit side, but not the deduction side. But honestly, at this point, I've looked into this because it's come up on our agenda a couple of times, but I'm not that familiar with everything that has been proposed. And myself, I'm not really interested in weighing into it right now. I think I would need a better briefing on what the pros and cons of this particular approach are. I have followed the discussion in Parliament a little bit, and certainly I've heard some good arguments and some ones that I thought were persuasive on both sides of this particular topic. So I'd just like it pulled separately because I haven't really made my mind up. I think I'll vote against it for now, but I'll think about it even between here and council.
Thank you. One other option maybe to refer it to for comment from staff specifically. And if you had specific questions you wished answered or through the analysis, that might be helpful to come out to. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, I appreciate my colleagues' comments on, the tax credit, but I also understand having a heritage building is costly too. And I guess I do have a question with these properties. Are they, are the municipal owned heritage properties included in this as well?
Through the chair, yes, there are municipally owned heritage properties that are included here. And looking just for an example, number 17 is Grosvenor Lodge, which is owned by the city. Elsie Perrin Williams Library, 305 Queens Avenue, Labatt Memorial Park at 25 Wilson. I could go on.
So that sort of leads me to sort of supporting and endorsing this letter. I think owning heritage properties are costly. If I've learned anything, being a councillor with the City of London, owning heritage buildings is very costly, and it is something that I think we do need help with, not only as a municipality, but private individuals as well, maintaining their properties. I don't have a problem endorsing.
Councillor Helmer.
Just one brief point, and this is where it's a good example of what I'm hesitant about. So, these are all income tax measures, and unfortunately, the City of London doesn't pay income tax, and nothing in what's being proposed is going to benefit the buildings that we own that are municipally significant and historically significant. Same goes for all the charities that own buildings. They don't pay income tax either, and it's not going to do anything to help them with the costs that they've got to incur because they're not paying income tax. They don't have taxable income to deduct, and they don't benefit from the tax credits. So it really is targeted at private property owners who are otherwise paying a lot of income tax or a small amount of income tax. And I certainly think there's something that could be done there, but I'm not sure that this is the right thing. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about it more. I'll think about it between here and council, like I said before.
Okay. Further questions, comments? Seeing none. Councillor Helmer has asked for, do you wish clause B in its entirety to be pulled separately?
No, just the I part. I'm totally fine with sending the letter from Latch saying that they support that. That's fine. It's just the part about BI, about a council endorsing the establishment of the tax credit.
Okay. Then we would look for that to be called separately. All right, so BI has been pulled, and the remainder of the recommendations are there for movement. I'd look for a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Park. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Okay, and with respect to BI, look for a motion on that. In a second. It's been moved by Councillor Park, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any further discussion? I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-2.
Thank you, and that concludes the items on the public agenda. Any further items? That's about it. So I would take a motion to move into confidential session with respect to C1, which is a matter pertaining to litigation or potential litigation with respect to the appeals to the Ontario Municipal Board arising out of the London Plan, and advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose and for the purpose of providing instructions and directions to officers and employees of the corporation with respect to the appeals to the Ontario Municipal Board arising out of the London Plan. A motion has been made by Councillor Park and seconded by Councillor Cassidy to move in camera. Vote will open now.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Thank you, and thank you to our visitors. I hope you enjoyed the show. We will report out from the committee room, so we won't be returning into this room.